fresh forest air filled my lungs as I settled into my hammock, ready for the third and final night of my solo camping trip in northeastern Ohio. The scary camping stories I heard as a child seemed so distant at that moment, enveloped by the tranquility of nature. Little did I know that I was about to live through one of the true horror stories that would haunt my thoughts for years. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up with an urgent need to urinate. I quietly stepped out of the hammock, walking a few paces away from my small campsite. That's when I noticed something that made my heart race. A headlamp about 30 meters away. I froze, my mind immediately filling with images from haunted camping tales. I observed for several minutes, trying to convince myself that it was just another camper, but something didn't feel right. The headlamp moved in a strange way, rising and falling as if someone was searching for something. Curiosity and fear battled within me, but I knew I had to investigate. With trembling hands, I put on my boots and grabbed my axe. Each step I took towards that mysterious light felt like approaching a camping nightmare. The damp ground muffled my footsteps as I stealthily made my way through the forest, my heart hammering so loudly I feared it could be heard. I was about 45 meters from my campsite when I spotted another headlamp. This one was closer, maybe just 12 meters away, moving between the trees. Terrified, I threw myself to the ground, covering myself with fallen leaves. The camping terror I had always thought was fiction was turning into a scary camping story right before my eyes. The man with the second headlamp passed within 3 meters of where I was lying, completely still. My heart felt like it wanted to leap out of my chest, and I struggled to control my breathing. The scary summer stories we used to tell around the campfire now seemed like a macabre prelude to this real-life camping horror. I watched in silence as the stranger stopped, lit a cigarette, and finished a beer. The sound of the can being thrown on the ground echoed in the quiet night, making me shudder. As soon as he moved away, I cautiously rose to my feet, determined to find out what was going on. I approached the first man I had seen, guided by the faint light of his cell phone. The sound of message notifications breaking the forest silence created a surreal atmosphere. I was close enough to see his face illuminated by the screen, when suddenly, he stood up and started walking towards my hammock. Panic took over me, turning this terrifying camping experience into something even more sinister. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing with terrible possibilities. Then, driven by survival instinct, I began to move silently back to my campsite. That's when I heard the sound of destruction, my tarp being ripped, flashlights flickering, and male voices discussing him being here. These true scary camping stories I was living seemed straight out of a summer horror movie. Lying on the cold forest floor, I watched helplessly as my flashlight moved away, becoming just a dot of light in the darkness. The reality of this situation, scarier than any ghost story around the campfire, began to sink in. I was alone, unarmed, and at the mercy of hostile strangers in a dark forest. The hours until dawn seemed endless, each forest sound amplifying my fear and anxiety. When the first rays of sunlight finally pierced the tree canopy, I rose from my makeshift hiding spot, my muscles sore from tension and immobility. The fear that had accompanied me throughout the night still pulsed in my veins, turning what should have been a peaceful summer morning into a setting worthy of the scariest camping stories. I walked hesitantly back to my campsite, my heart heavy with anticipation of what I would find. The scene that greeted me was one of pure devastation, surpassing any scary camping experience I could have imagined. My hammock and tarp were in tatters, as if they had been attacked by a wild animal, or in this case, by men with hatchets. The ground was covered with the remains of what had once been my forest refuge. My survival kit lay trampled, its contents scattered like macabre confetti. The absence of my backpack, raincoat, and flashlight confirmed my suspicions. The intruders were not only vandalizing but also stealing. This wasn't just one of the many scary campfire stories, it was a real and tangible violation of my safety and property. Determined to better understand what had happened, I followed the trail left by the intruders. At the spot where I'd seen the first man, I found disturbing evidence of his presence. Pouches of chewing tobacco, 8 empty beer cans, and a discarded lighter. Each item told a story of disregard and potential violence that made my stomach churn. Continuing my improvised investigation, I reached the point where the second man had stopped. The scene was even more disturbing. An empty bag that likely contained drugs cigarette butts scattered everywhere, and most repulsive of all, a pile of human feces with no sign of toilet paper. The raw and dirty reality of this terrifying camping experience hit me with full force, leaving me nauseated and deeply shaken. Standing amidst the wreckage of what should have been a peaceful nature adventure, I felt a mix of emotions overwhelming me. Anger, fear, confusion, and a deep sense of violation swirled within me, creating an internal whirlwind that threatened to knock me down. This experience surpassed any of the scary camping stories I had ever heard. It was real, visceral, and it had changed something fundamental inside me. With trembling hands, I began to gather what remained of my belongings. Each destroyed item was a reminder of the vulnerability I had experienced during the night. Memories of the terror-filled moments, lying still while strangers invaded my space, flashed in my mind like scenes from a summer camping horror movie. As I packed up, I couldn't help but think about how this experience compared to the true horror stories people share. I had always thought those stories were exaggerated, perhaps even made up to scare others. Now, I was the protagonist of one of those stories, and the reality was far more terrifying than any fiction. The sun was already high in the sky when I finally finished packing what was left. I looked one last time at the place that had been my temporary home for 2 nights. Now it looked like a scene straight out of haunted camping tales. The marks of the invasion were everywhere, reminding me that the true threats don't always come from the supernatural or the unknown, but often from other human beings. As I walked away from the campsite, carrying the weight of the remnants of my adventure and the memories that would haunt me for a long time, I made a promise to myself I would never underestimate the power of scary forest stories or the importance of precaution. Even in the seemingly most tranquil places, this haunted summer night had taught me a valuable lesson about the reality of danger and the fragility of the safety we often take for granted. As I walked back to civilization, I knew I carried with me not only the physical remains of my adventure, but also a new understanding of the world and myself, an understanding born of fear, survival, and the determination to never be caught unprepared again. The sun was setting as we arrived at the public park near Antigonish, Nova Scotia. My wife and I were exhausted after a long day of traveling. Eager to set up camp and rest, the spot seemed perfect. A cliff overlooking the ocean, secluded and peaceful. Only a couple of elderly folks and a fifth wheel occupied the space beyond us. "Look, dear, an old lighthouse," my wife exclaimed, pointing to the imposing structure near the parking lot. We decided to pitch our tent right there at the base of the lighthouse. The salty sea air filled our lungs as we unloaded the car. As we set up the tent, I noticed something odd about the lighthouse. "Are you seeing this?" I asked. The light was blinking in a peculiar pattern. 2 seconds on, 3 seconds off, repeatedly. "Must be normal," she replied, shrugging it off. I tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that was starting to settle in my stomach. As night fell, the wind picked up, bringing with it a low, constant howl. The trees in the surrounding forest seemed to bend towards us, as if reaching out to grab us. I tried to shake off these dark thoughts, focusing on preparing our simple dinner. Sitting outside the tent, we watched the stars emerge in the dark sky. The rhythmic blinking of the lighthouse created dancing shadows around us. My wife snuggled closer to me, trembling slightly. "It's getting chilly," she murmured. But I knew it wasn't just the cold that bothered her. There was something in the air, a palpable tension that made my hairs stand on end. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with a start. The lighthouse's intermittent blinking continued its relentless pattern, illuminating the tent walls at regular intervals. But it wasn't the light that had awakened me. A strange sound was coming from the forest that surrounded us, a low, drawn-out moan that made my heart race. "Are you hearing that?" I whispered to my wife, who had also woken up. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. We sat in silence, straining to hear every noise. The moan was replaced by an unsettling buzzing, as if thousands of insects were approaching. Then we heard what sounded like distant crying. My mind raced, trying to find rational explanations for these disturbing sounds. Could they be wild animals? The wind howling through the trees? Or something more sinister? The scary camping stories we heard as children suddenly seemed terribly real. The lighthouse continued its relentless cycle, 2 seconds on, 3 seconds off. With each moment of darkness, I swore I could see shadows moving outside the tent. My wife clutched my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered, her voice shaking. I wanted to agree, wanted to jump in the car and drive away from this haunted place, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or the morbid curiosity that makes us want to uncover the source of our fears. "Let's wait until dawn," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. It can't be much longer now. Little did I know that the night still held more terrifying surprises. The minutes dragged on like hours as we waited for sunrise. The lighthouse kept its hypnotic rhythm, and the strange sounds from the forest didn't cease. My wife and I huddled together, seeking comfort in each other's arms as we faced this scary summer night. Suddenly we heard footsteps approaching our tent. My heart leaped to my throat. Were these the owners of those mysterious voices, or perhaps the old sea captain my overactive imagination had conjured? With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent, prepared for the worst. To my surprise and relief, it was the elderly couple from the fifth wheel. "Are you hearing those noises too?" the gentleman asked, his voice trembling with concern. I nodded, feeling a wave of relief that we weren't the only ones experiencing this camping terror. Together, we decided to investigate the source of the sounds. With flashlights in hand, we ventured into the forest. As we drew closer, the noises became clearer. To our surprise, they weren't ghostly moans or supernatural cries, but the sound of industrial equipment. At dawn, we discovered the truth behind our night of horror. A construction was underway at the bottom of the cliff, hidden from our view. The moans and buzzing were actually the sound of machines working through the night. The crying was the wind passing through exposed pipes. We laughed nervously, relieved to find out that our terrifying camping experience had a perfectly normal explanation. The lighthouse, we later learned, blinked in that peculiar way to warn ships about the ongoing construction. As we packed up our camp, we reflected on how our minds can twist the unknown into something terrifying. This trip taught us a valuable lesson about facing our fears and seeking the truth behind them. We got back into the car, exhausted but relieved, ready to continue our journey. Although we hadn't encountered actual ghosts or supernatural entities, this night would forever remain in our memory as one of the scariest camping stories we had ever experienced. As we drove away from the cliff, the morning sun finally dispelled the last shadows of the previous night. My wife and I remained silent for a while, each lost in our own thoughts about our haunted camping experience. "You know," she finally broke the silence, "despite the scare, it was actually an interesting night." I laughed, still a bit nervous. "Interesting is a gentle way of saying terrifying," I replied, but I had to agree with her. Our nocturnal adventure would certainly be a great story to tell our friends. As the miles passed, we started discussing other scary camping stories we had heard. We compared our experience with famous camping legends and forest horror tales. Although our story had a rational explanation in the end, we realized it was no less thrilling than those with supernatural elements. "It's funny how fear can distort our perception," I commented. "Those normal construction sounds turned into a symphony of terror in our minds." My wife nodded, adding, "And the lighthouse. Who would have thought a blinking light could scare us so much?" As the day progressed, and we neared our next destination, we stopped for lunch at a small roadside diner. There, we shared our story with the friendly waiter, who listened with interest. "You're not the first ones to be spooked by that cliff," he told us with a knowing smile. "We've got plenty of mysterious summer stories around here." We left the diner with a new perspective. Our involuntary night of terror had turned into a funny anecdote, a true scary camping story of summer to add to our collection of travel memories. "I guess we learned a valuable lesson," my wife said as we got back on the road. "Sometimes the scariest things are the ones we create in our own minds." I agreed, feeling a new appreciation for our ability to face the unknown together. As we continued our journey through Nova Scotia, We carried with us not only the memory of a scary night, but also a new sense of adventure and a deeper understanding of how our minds interpret the world around us. And who knows, maybe at our next stop, we would encounter more intriguing stories to add to our collection of mysterious camping tales. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink as I set up my tent in the secluded clearing. It was my 13th solo camping trip, and I felt more confident than ever. The fresh forest air filled my lungs, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. I smiled, feeling the familiar sense of freedom that only the wild could provide. As I arranged my belongings, my mind wandered to the scary camping stories we used to tell around the campfire when I was a child. I chuckled quietly, thinking of how distant those tales seemed now. I was an experienced camper after all. Nothing could scare me here. Night fell quickly, and I lit a small campfire. The flames danced, casting restless shadows on the trees around me. I picked up my favorite book and snuggled close to the fire, letting myself get absorbed in the story. Occasionally a branch would snap in the darkness, but I barely noticed, engrossed in my reading. Hours passed, and I finally decided it was time to sleep. I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, eager for the day of hiking that awaited me. I lay down in my sleeping bag, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake a strange unease. It was as if something was out of place, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I shook my head, brushing off these thoughts. It's just the remnants of those old horror stories, I told myself. Little did I know that I was about to live through my own scary camping experience, one that would surpass any ghost story I had ever heard. Weeks after my return, I sat in my office, eager to relive the memories of my latest nature adventure. I spread the newly developed photos across the table, a nostalgic smile playing on my lips. The first images were exactly what I expected: breathtaking landscapes, fascinating wildlife, and moments of pure serenity. My heart skipped a beat when I reached the 5th roll. There, among the usual photos, was an image that froze the blood in my veins. It was me, sleeping in my tent, the flash of the camera illuminating my serene face. My hands trembled as I flipped to the next photo. Again, there I was, asleep on a different night. A chill ran down my spine as I frantically flipped through the remaining photos. Every 3rd or 4th image, there I was, completely vulnerable in my sleep. The dates on the corners of the photos confirmed my worst nightmare. Someone had been watching me throughout my entire trip, invading my most intimate space night after night. Memories of the trip flooded my mind. The man fishing at the truck stop. Could it have been him? Or someone I hadn't even noticed? The scary stories I had dismissed as mere haunted camping tales now seemed terrifyingly real. My refuge in nature had turned into a summer camp horror story setting. Tears of fear and anger streamed down my face as I faced the evidence of my naivety. How could I have been so careless? How did I not notice the presence of an intruder for 2 whole weeks? The forest I so loved now seemed like a dark, threatening place, filled with unseen dangers and malicious gazes. The weeks following my terrifying discovery were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Every shadow in my home seemed to hide a threat. Every nocturnal noise made me jump. My husband, concerned, tried to comfort me, but his reassuring words felt empty against the horror I had experienced. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to face my fears. I sat in the living room, the photos spread out before me in the dim light of a lamp. I forced myself to examine each image, searching for clues, any detail that could help me understand what had happened. That was when I noticed something I had missed in my initial review. In one of the photos, partially hidden by the shadows of the tent, there was a silhouette. It was just an outline, but unmistakably human. My heart raced. That shadowy figure was tangible proof that my terrifying camping experiences were not a product of my imagination. Someone had indeed been there, watching me, invading my space. With trembling hands, I picked up my phone and called the police. The words tumbled out in a torrent as I reported my scary camping story, the true ghost stories of summer I had lived. The officer on the other end of the line listened patiently, but I could sense the incredulity in his voice as he promised to investigate. As I hung up the phone, a realization hit me with full force. My love for nature, my passion for camping, All of it had been stained by this experience. The forests that once brought me peace now seemed haunted by unseen presences. The nocturnal sounds that used to calm me now. I realized that perhaps I would never be able to enjoy a night under the stars without being haunted by the memories of that terrible summer. Months passed, and the police investigation led nowhere. The authorities classified the incident as an isolated case, likely the work of some intrusive hiker. But to me, the wound remained open, an invisible scar that I carried with me every day. One afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Sarah, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. She invited me to a camper reunion, a gathering around the campfire to share stories and memories. My first instinct was to refuse, but something within me hesitated. Perhaps, I thought, facing my fears could be the first step to overcoming them. On the night of the gathering, I sat rigidly around the fire, surrounded by smiling faces and lively voices. The smell of the smoke and the warmth of the flames brought back memories I had tried to bury. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. Then, with a deep sigh, I began to tell my story. As the words flowed, I saw the smiles turn into expressions of shock and sympathy. I shared the details of the photos, the feeling of violation, the fear that now accompanied me. To my surprise, instead of judgment, I found understanding. Others began to share their own scary camping experiences, stories of strange encounters and inexplicable moments in the forests. As I listened to these narratives, something shifted within me. I realized that I wasn't alone in my fears, that others also carried similar scars. The scary campfire stories we were sharing weren't just tales to entertain, but a way to process our experiences, to find strength in our shared vulnerability. On that night, as the flames died down and the stars shone above, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The fear was still there, a shadowy presence in the corners of my mind. But now I had something more, the understanding that even the most terrifying experiences can teach us about resilience and the importance of community. As I walked home under the starry sky, I promised myself that one day, maybe not today, nor tomorrow, but someday, I would return to the forests, not to forget, but to rediscover the beauty I had once known, armed with the strength I had found in my own story of overcoming. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.